we're in New York City, and we're going to be asking people what they know about China and why China matters. Let's find out. What do you know about China?
Everything.
Not a thing. It's a country.
Where my parents are from.
Communism.
Pandas.
China Wall. Confucianism.
Crab Rangoon, cheese wonton.
We have a Chinese roommate, Yi.
I just know it's a big place, like big country.
There's like mainland China and then other places in China.
Island of Hainan is, where Shanghai is.
Are you aware or interested to know key indicators that would disclose or yield the truth that indeed Americans love China? Yes, you heard it right, that in this newsy item I will bear that Americans love China. But first, click the buttons like, share, and subscribe below for you to continuously be informed of newsy items that are rarely shared to the public. Do you know that since the 18th century, the relations between the US and China had been deemed complex, erratic, and ingrained with mutual suspicion and distrust? Despite this, the US-China relationship is viewed as the most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century due to its contributions and impact to global stability, international trade relations, development directions of countries, way of living, among others. Before I dwell on the love story angle of Americans clinging for China, allow me first to recall some significant historical events that would show expressions of hatred of Americans for China. Although anti-Chinese sentiments had already been felt in the 18th century, the anti-Chinese sentiments of Americans heightened during the Cold War that was fueled by the 1919 to 1920 First Red Scare, which also coincided with the increasing fear of communist espionage because of the Chinese Civil War and China's participation in the Korean War. During the era of Red Scare, Chinese Americans residing in the US were the victims and suspected of being affiliated with the Communist Party of China. It was estimated that hundreds of suspected communists were imprisoned and an estimated 12,000 lost their jobs. The second notable anti-Chinese sentiment took place in 1950 when top Chinese scientist Qian Shuaishan's security clearance was revoked and thus spent 5 years under house arrest. Dan Kimball, the Undersecretary of the Navy at that time, tried to keep Qian in the US and argued and made a statement that it was the stupidest thing this country ever did. He was no more a communist than I was. In 1955, the US deported Qian to China in exchange for 5 American pilots captured during the Korean War. Incidentally, Qian became the father of modern Chinese space program. Under COVID-19 pandemic, one can read and view in multimedia and social media expressions of hatred against China projected by Americans, including President Trump. I really spreading hatred. Now let us proceed with the most important gist of this video. Evidences to prove the love of Americans for China. Love of Americans for China blossomed through milestones initiated by the American government. The 1971 ping-pong diplomacy was the first public sign of warming relations between the US and China when the US accepted the invitation of China and sent the US ping-pong team accompanied by journalists on April 6, 1971. The US players were chronicled as among the first Americans allowed to officially enter China since 1949. It was believed that the ping-pong policy paved the way to the secret trip to China of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in July 1971. The secret trip was followed by the 8-day trip on February 1972 of President Nixon to China, who had a meeting with Chairman Mao Zedong and signed the Shanghai Communique with Premier Zhou Enlai. The communique was instrumental to an improved US-China relation. In 1979, under President Jimmy Carter, the US granted China full diplomatic recognition and at the same time acknowledged China's One China principle. U.S. commitment to the One China policy was further reiterated by President Ronald Reagan when he signed the Third Joint Communique in August 1982. President Reagan visited China in April 1984, and subsequently the U.S. government allowed China the purchase of U.S. military equipment. In 2000, President Bill Clinton signed the U.S.-China Relations Act of 2000, granting normal trade relations with China. The Clinton administration argued that more trade with China would advance America's economic interests. The act somehow paved the way for China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. So far, what had been described is the courting China phase, initiated by previous U.S. administrations. Now is the time to show the evidences that Americans indeed love China. The intensity of love accorded by Americans to China can be demonstrated by the following evidences. First, the trade relation evidence. Gauging from different trade reports and documents available online, this evidence can be characterized in many ways. Allow me to cite a few, like starting or between 1980 and 2004, trade relations with China reached $231 billion. Starting 2006, U.S. allowed China to dislodge Mexico as its second largest trading partner after Canada. The U.S. imported $4.6 billion in agricultural products from China in 2017. The top U.S. import commodities from China were fruits and vegetables, fresh and processed, snack food, spices, and tea, the combined of which accounted for nearly half of the total U.S. agricultural inputs from China. For your information, Chinese suppliers made up 70 to 80% of Walmart's merchandise, leaving 20% of merchandise sourced or made of American and other countries. Top export categories. 7.2% of total U.S. exports in 2018 was composed of the following categories. A. Aircraft, $18 billion. B. Machinery, $14 billion. C. Electrical machinery, $13 billion. D. Optical and medical instruments, $9.8 billion. And E. Vehicles, $9.4 billion. U.S. exports beef to China keep soaring, with exports in September 2019 totaled to 7,300 metric tons and was valued at $60.8 million. Starting 2019, China became the largest trading partner of USA, with exports reaching $429.7 billion, EU as second highest at $375.1 billion, and Japan $137.2 billion. Financial relation evidence. The increasing intensity of this evidence can be described by numerous sources, to wit: according to the document on main holders of U.S. Treasury, China's holdings of U.S. Treasuries approximately reached $180 billion in August 2015. The Jeffrey Bartash of MarketWatch published in August 23, 2018, that according to U.S. Treasury, that 30% of U.S. debt was owned by foreign entities mainly from China and Japan. As of May 1, 2020, Wikipedia stated that the total national debt of U.S. reached $24.95 trillion, with $5.9 trillion considered as intra-governmental holdings. The Kimberly Amadeo of National Debt surmised that China is so far the biggest financial provider of America. U.S. debt to China was $1.08 trillion in March 2020, making China the second greatest amount of U.S. debt held by a foreign country, next to Japan owning about $1.27 trillion. Historically, China's maximum holding of 9.1% or $1.3 trillion of U.S. debt occurred in 2011. Tourism relation evidence. This evidence can be elaborated by the different publications, including the China Daily USA, to wit: for 13 consecutive years, a cumulative total of 75.6 million Chinese was allowed entry to the U.S. by the U.S. Immigration as international visitors for business, medical, education, and leisure purposes, spending a collective $244.7 billion across the U.S. In 2016, U.S. immigration allowed the entry of 2.97 million Chinese tourists, spending a total of $33 billion, putting China on top of visitor spending, followed by Canada, Mexico, Japan, and UK. US made China dominate the rankings as the number one market for US tourism exports, injecting more than $90 million a day into the US economy. As compiled by the National Travel and Tourism Office or NTTO, U.S. travel and tourism exports in 2016 accounted for 61% of all U.S. services exports to China. Chinese cuisine evidence. The taste of this evidence is seen and felt in the records of the National Restaurant Association statistics. In 1849, the Canton Restaurant opened in San Francisco as the first known Chinese restaurant in the U.S. Over time, the number of Chinese restaurants has ballooned to about 50,000 across the U.S. as of 2017. Of the 10 most popular cuisines in the U.S., Chinese cuisine is the most craved by Americans, followed by Mexican, Italian, and Japanese cuisines. The popularity of Chinese cuisine and mushrooming of Chinese restaurants is partly attributable to the Chinese American community, considered to be the largest overseas Chinese community outside Asia. According to the Chinese ethnic chart unveiled that the population of Chinese Americans have continually been increasing from 4,018 in 1850 to more than 5 million in 2017, which could be one of the factors in the proliferation of Chinese restaurants and popularity of Chinese cuisine. American companies in China evidence. This evidence can be extracted from the disclosures made by Kenneth Raposa of Forbes. From a corporate perspective, that China is and was more preferred than India, Mexico, and Brazil because of 7 reasons. First, tax reason. China's corporate tax rate is 25%. It is deemed cheaper than the 35% tax rate of India, 34% of Brazil, and 30% of Mexico. Second, labor reason. American corporations opted to be in China because China wages are still cheaper than the wages in Brazil and Mexico. This aspect of China labor is yearned for by American corporations despite the apprehension expressed by the International Trade Union Confederation that China is one of the world's worst countries in terms of labor rights. Third, perpetual political leadership control reason. Compared to India, Brazil, and Mexico that change governments every few years or elections, China has none of these problems. American companies in China argued that this is one less headache for them because continuity makes life easier for businesses. Fourth, lower energy cost reason. American companies in China that are conscious of electricity prices believe that China's $0.08 per kilowatt hour is better than Brazil's electricity rate, notwithstanding Brazil's electricity-related taxes. The speculations would tell that the electricity price of China is attributable to state subsidies or to the abundance of electricity from the massive Three Gorges Dam power plant in Yangtze. Fifth, port logistics reason. Seaports in China are rated world-class compared to Mexico ports that are governed by cartels and the poor port infrastructure of India. Sixth, crime frequency reason. Kay Raposa, again of Forbes, gathered from American companies in China that crime is not rampant in China as in emerging markets such as India, Mexico, and Brazil. From this angle, one can surmise that the quality of life for expat workers is safer in China. And lastly, American population in China reason. On top of these observations and findings of Forbes, there were American tourists and workers based in China who perceived that the presence of pockets of American communities have somehow contributed to a feeling of acceptance by Chinese of Americans in their country. Feeling at home Americans in China are composed of expatriates and immigrants from the US, as well as those locally born descendants, which is estimated to be around 110,000.
Honestly, I'm embarrassed by how little we know now. China's all the way over there, so like we need to bridge the gap. We need to know what's going on over there.
Concluding statements. The configuration, intensity, and harmony between the American and Chinese peoples will soon be largely determined by the coming presidential election results of the US, bearing two possibilities. Scenario 1. American love for China will continue to dwindle. Trump, a Republican, is re-elected. Scenario 2. Possibility of another honeymoon. Democrat wins. Setting aside US politics, you might have seen how many Americans, considered as the super race, have expressed their affection, preference, and humane treatment of Chinese or China in many ways other than what had been mentioned. These will clearly reveal that these China-loving Americans would want the two countries to coexist in the midst of their differing uniqueness and aspirations. Perhaps curious questions that would ignite multidimensional and generational imaginations would be: how much love will Americans give to China? Will loving China too much or too little allow US or Americans better control or influence in the Asia-Pacific region? Only God or Shang-Ti knows how American love for China will be everlasting. Before I end, I'm providing a list of my 4 other available videos for you to watch on my YouTube channel, True Cyclops, and the list of videos that are coming soon to the same channel. Finally, thanks for clicking the subscribe, like, and share buttons.